friends, Greg Kokel here, Stand to Reason, and we're going to devote this entire hour to conversation with a dear friend and someone who's had a tremendous impact on the body of Christ for a long time. She's the author of Love by Thy Body. She is the author of Saving Leonardo and Finding Truth, and famously Total Truth, all award-winning best-selling books. Noted by Christianity Today as one of the 5 top women apologists in the country. Of course, I'm talking about Professor Nancy Pearcey, and in my view, Nancy, you are the number one woman apologist in the country, so you got the top votes for me. So glad to have you on board.
Thanks so much, and thanks for that compliment. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think the last time we were actually together, other than this time on screen here, was when we were in Israel together in 2019. What an amazing trip. And it was just great to kind of sit in the bus together as we were traveling around and comparing notes. And it was really a fabulous opportunity to get to know you better, and I really enjoyed that. I want to start this book with the way you started it. This book we're talking about is The Toxic War on Masculinity, subtitle How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. It is, in a certain sense, I don't want to say a controversial book so much, but a controversial topic, clearly, which I think is why you write the book. And just so you know, I'm not the only one on my team that has read this book. You get rave reviews from everybody. There's the Bearded Beast over there. Kyle, he's given it a thumbs up, and Amy's halfway through, and she's really, really enjoying it, and I the same. It's a complex book, though, because it's a complex issue, so we're going to hit some of these things. And I want to start the way you start the book. And your first words, the first line, and I characteristically read first lines of books just to see how people launch their enterprise, and you did so well with this. Your line was, I had 2 fathers, a public one and a private one. One line, one paragraph, and then you go into your story. Tell us about your story a little bit as you launch this book on toxic masculinity.
Yes, I do start the book with a story of my own life because I had a very abusive childhood. My father was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they sometimes ask, was it open hand or closed fist? Mm-hmm. And it was closed fist. Mm. He was punching us and kicking us, and it is a good reason why I started asking questions about Christianity as I got into high school, because my parents were very strong Lutherans. I don't know if you know this, but all Scandinavians are Lutheran, the way that all Irish are Catholic.
Gotcha.
My dad's Swedish, my mom's Norwegian, so what else are we going to be? Uh-huh. But it is it was a big part of my trying to understand this topic, because, of course, as you might expect, as I grew older, I went into the radical feminist stream and read all the major books on feminism. For years, I considered myself a feminist, mm-hmm. which is, I think, a natural reaction to feeling like, men are evil because I had such an abusive father. Right. And so it was, the way I put it in the introduction to the book is, in one sense, I've been writing this book my whole life, mm-hmm. because it has taken me that long to really figure out a positive biblical understanding of masculinity. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people have said it gives the book somewhat more credibility. Mm-hmm. A psychologist reviewed the book for Amazon, and he mm-hmm. said, well, we know she's not writing from an ivory tower.
That's right.
She's writing from the trenches.
It was a jaw. I mean, almost literally a jaw dropper for me. You had me from the very first sentence because we've known each other for a number of years. You don't remember the first time that I met you, but I do, and that was in the early '90s. With Chuck Colson, when you were working with that enterprise. I was actually being interviewed by Chuck as one of the stable of writers that did Breakpoint, and it was not a successful interview. Passed me over, but he passed me on to you, and I guess he let me go. But that was my first encounter with you then, and then of course we've had times to touch base ever since then, and been on the show. But this was a jaw dropper to me. And because it's very easy to have a image in your mind of the public persona of an individual and not realize the experience that they actually bring to the table in this whole enterprise. And so I think it does add more credibility. And the one thing I want to focus in on, not to belabor this particular point, but what you said was a public one and a private one. Now, you just mentioned in private what your father was like, but he was very different in public. And I think this contrast is a big part of how you position your material in the book on the toxic war on masculinity. So tell us about that too.
Yeah, good point. So he was a university professor. He taught mathematics, and then as computers were invented, he taught MIS, Management and Information Systems, and he taught all around the world. So we lived in Germany where he taught, and we lived in Norway. He taught for several years at the Middle East Technical University, which is in Ankara, Turkey. So he was a very well-respected professional in his field, and very polite, very appealing, very charismatic. So I don't think anyone ever guessed what he was like at home. And I think that's important, like you say, because again, we tend to judge people by how they appear. And I have to tell you the one thing, you'll appreciate this. There was one person who saw through him, and that was somebody at L'Abri. We were talking before going on air about how we had both visited L'Abri in times past, and I was there the first time in 1971. And the people sometimes ask me, why did you go to a Christian ministry if you were not a Christian? And the answer is that actually my parents were passing through Europe on their way home from Turkey, and they were driving through L'Abri, and they stopped at L'Abri as sort of one of the first generation of touristy Christians,
right?
Who went through L'Abri.
Yeah, that was kind of the way I was in '76 when I came through. Yeah, it was like I'd already familiar with Dr. Schaefer and his books and everything. I just wanted to kind of stand on that holy ground a little bit I benefited from interactions there with the team, whatever. But go ahead.
Yes. So my parents, I was going to school in Europe at the time, in Germany. We had lived in Europe when I was a child, and so I had gone back. And so it wasn't that much to say, hey, come on down. We're in Switzerland, come on down and see us. And so that's why I went to L'Abri, not to go to a Christian ministry. Right. I had no interest in that. I had given up my faith halfway through high school, so it had been several years ago. But I went there to see my parents. And this is a part of my time at L'Abri that I reveal for the first time in this book, because I've talked before about how I became a Christian ultimately through L'Abri, through Francis Schaeffer's Apologetics. It really spoke to me. It took 2 trips, 2 visits to L'Abri, a year and a half apart.
Yeah.
But it was the Apologetics that Francis Schaeffer wrote so much about and spoke about that persuaded me that Christianity was true. And so it's a key part of my conversion. But what I tell in this book for the first time is it was also the beginning of that emotional, psychological, spiritual healing from my childhood trauma. And when my parents came in, Dr. Schaefer used to have a Saturday night discussion.
Right.
And so, of course, that was what my parents came to that first night when we were there.
Is that what he did by the fireplace there in the chapel? Yeah, because I was at one of those as well. Yeah, and everybody sits on the floor. Yeah, at least when I was there. I don't know how it was at your time, but your dad came to that, you were saying, right? And
right. So, we just arrived, and we came to the Schaefer's fireside chat.
Right.
And on staff at L'Abri was a psychiatric social worker. Her name was Sheila Bird, and we called her Birdie. And it was Sheila Bird who helped me to really start on the whole process of applying my Christianity, not just to the mind, the intellect, but applying it to the heart, and to the trauma of my childhood. But here was the interesting thing. As our family walked in that night, she looked at my father. She told me this later. She looked at my father and she said, "There is a man who oppresses everyone around him."
Oh, my goodness.
So she saw it. So when I started going to talk to her, she knew why I was there.
Wow.
I didn't even have to tell her. She knew I was there because of my father. And I thought that was fascinating. As far as I know, she's the only person who's ever seen through, his glossy professional exterior.
Right. And plus he was a churchman and had a role in church there, right?
Obviously, I should have mentioned that. Oh, yes, that was part of the being Lutheran. You went to church every Sunday, no matter what. I mean, absolutely rigorous church attendance.
So
and Christian school, Lutheran school. I should add, I went to Lutheran elementary school. So yeah, we were Lutheran, dyed in the wool.
So it's not surprising then that, as you said, in high school you would have given up your faith, and now you're looking for something else, and you're moving to feminism, entirely predictable under those circumstances. The reason I'm focusing in on this is I do think this public one, private one, this motif here, that it really, I hear the echoes of that throughout the book as you're talking about the problem of toxicity, male toxicity, which is clearly a problem, but I think it's deeply misunderstood. And you do such a superb job of parsing out the details historically, and also this curious thing about Christian dads who could be, good dad, bad dad, kind of thing like you experienced. And this, of course, has given a bad face to Christianity, which is why you left Christianity to begin with. That would be my takeaway from that experience. Would that be fair?
Yes. I don't want to make it sound like it was just an emotional reaction, because I had genuine questions as well.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, when I first started asking questions, about halfway through high school, I literally went to my father and I said, "Why are you a Christian?" He said, "Works for me." That's it? You're a university professor?
That's the best
That's
you
all
can
you've
do.
got?
Yeah.
And I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean. I don't always say this, but this was an uncle, a Lutheran uncle. And I thought I might get something more substantial, but all he said was, "Don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes."
Yeah.
So this was the quality of the answer that I was getting. And so I did finally think, well, I guess maybe Christianity just doesn't have any answers.
Yeah.
And that's when I walked away from my faith very intentionally. I didn't just drift, right? I very
Right.
intentionally said,
Done with that.
if I don't have any good reasons to believe it, then I shouldn't say I believe it,
Yeah,
whether it's
yeah.
Christianity or anything else.
Yeah. And
So there were
sorry.
definitely intellectual questions then, as I adopted all these secular isms until I went to L'Abri.
So, there is some wisdom in the response as far as it goes, that everybody has doubts. But the problem is it goes further than that, and there are ways to reconcile doubts in people's hearts, and there are answers to questions and stuff. And that sometimes is a dismissal that doesn't ultimately help.
Well, it came across as it's just a psychological phase that you're going through.
Yeah, that's right.
And you'll outgrow it. Don't worry.
Yeah, right. So, like I said, the reason I mentioned this is because there was this contrast, and of course, because people have experience with men being toxic in the expression of their masculinity, there's a generalization of that toxicity, not just to men, but especially to Christian men, which you develop in your book. So let me ask you this question. How would you characterize the so-called problem of toxic masculinity that we hear about currently in our culture, that you seek to remedy, or at least to clarify in the book? What is it that people see there, that they're being confronted with, that you are seeking to clarify and address and bring some substance of understanding to?
Yeah, that's such a broad question. And can I answer that historically? A lot of the book deals with the historical development of a toxic or secular view of masculinity.
Okay.
And one part of that, one of the most important parts of it was the rise of Darwinian evolution. And a lot of us don't realize that. We think of evolution in terms of fossils and genes and scientific questions, but we don't realize it had an enormous impact on people's view of masculinity. So Darwinian thinkers began to say the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would by necessity be rough, ruthless, rugged, brutal, savage, barbarian, and even predatory. And so they said, your true masculinity, your true nature is getting in touch with the beast within. And so whereas Christianity had urged men to live up to the image of God in them, Darwinian thinkers began to say, no, your true authentic nature is the animal within. And by the way, Darwin also did say that women are intellectually inferior to men. So he has some responsibility for that part of toxic masculinity as well.
Right.
But the social Darwinism has come back in our own day. It's not just historical. It's now called evolutionary psychology.
Right.
The idea if the body evolves, so does your psychology. All your thoughts and feelings have to evolve. And evolutionary psychologists are still saying that men are by nature crude, rude, and lewd. So there was a best-selling book, called The Moral Animal. And the author says, the human male is an obsessive, oppressive, flesh-obsessed pig. Giving him a book on how to have a good marriage is like giving a Viking a book on how not to pillage.
Yeah, right. Is that Robert White?
Robert Wright, yes, you got it.
I actually, I have that book. I've read the book and used it in some other writings I've done. But yeah, this is what follows. And a lot of folks don't think about the entailments that are involved in certain worldviews. And so social Darwinism is another expression of this kind of thing that actually was coincident with the Industrial Revolution at its peak. And you talk a lot about that. Before I get to that, though, I want you to tell us another story, because this is it's a story in contrast, and it's of contrasts of two different understandings, and it's something very close to me because the Borderline Bar is 1.5 miles from my house. From 1917, was it? Or 28, I'm sorry, not 19, 2018, the Borderline Bar and that killing that was done there, which you cite there. And this choked me up to recall this event that was so big, right? My wife used to go dancing there, and line dancing was a country and western bar, but there was a famous killing there in 2018, and a group shooting. But there was two ways to understand that, and you told a side of the story. There's one type of masculinity that was expressed in the killer, but there was another type of masculinity that was also expressed in some others, particularly one man. By contrast, and do you recall that account well enough to be? Yeah, please.
Yes, because I start the book with that. You want to start a book with something intense and grabs the reader. Well, I've had a lot of people tell me that grabbed them.
That's right.
It did the job, because it was a famous mass killing in a bar, and the killer was a young man. In his early 20s, 23, I think. Ian David Long was his name. Former Marine, divorced, living in his mother's basement. I mean, all the typical failure to launch stereotypes right there. And he came into the bar one night when he knew it would be full of college students, and threw smoke bombs to cause confusion, and then just started firing into the crowd. In the bar that night was a young man named Wennerstrom. What was his first name? Wennerstrom. Matt Wennerstrom. And he was 21, and he was a college student, and he immediately, as soon as the shots started booming out, he grabbed a bunch of people, put them under a pool table for protection. And then when the shooter stopped to reload, he broke a back window with a bar stool and started shepherding people out. He and a couple of other young men, and they kept coming back into the bar as often as they could to bring more people out. And by the way, the shooter finally shot himself. And it was fascinating to read the interviews on the night of the shooting. People asked Matt Wennerstrom, how did you have such mental control, to respond so effectively and to save so many lives? And he said, I know where I'm going when I die, so I wasn't worried about it. I'm okay if I die because I know where I'm going. Now, anyone who reads this who's a Christian knows exactly what he meant by that.
Right.
What he meant was he knew as a Christian. And then he did comment, this comment got dropped from the story, but then he talked about how he was still praying for the people who were still missing. So it was clear. Yeah, I open it with, two different versions of masculinity. One used his masculine strength to take lives. The other used his masculine strength to save lives.
There is a portion of that description, though, where there's a kind of a huddle while the bullets are flying. Do you remember that? Can you tell us about that?
Well, one of the young women who was interviewed afterwards, I think she was the one who was there for her birthday. There was a birthday celebration. And she commented on how not only Matt Wennerstrom, but also several other young men, huddled around. Earlier I said they pushed them under a pool table for protection, and then they huddled around them. And she says every one of those young men was ready to take a bullet for us.
Yeah.
She's like, whoa. Now this is, what's the opposite of toxic masculinity? This is the opposite. These are men who are willing to take a bullet to protect innocent people.
Mm-hmm. So you make this distinction. This is a good illustration of it, of the distinction between a good man and a quote-unquote real man, a kind of understanding of masculinity that kind of developed out of a variety of social pressures that has created all kinds of confusion. And you also give a magnificent anecdote in there about the men's Titanic society, I think you call it, and to celebrate those men on the Titanic who essentially did the same thing. Women and children first. We're going to stay and go down with the boat, and how these men are toasted on a regular basis by the society to reflect the genuine, good, virtuous, heroic, deep masculinity of these men that were willing to go down with the ship. And let the women and children be rescued. This is a contrast that you really demonstrate, or you trade on throughout your book as you're looking at these social factors.
Right. So this was, I'll give you a little bit of the background that's not in the book, because as you noted, it's the most controversial book I've ever written, which did surprise me because I really thought Love Thy Body would be more controversial. Mm-hmm. It covers topics like abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, which is really mushroomed now. But this one was more controversial, and I ran lots of classes on it. I led lots of reading groups because I like to get feedback, rub off the rough edges. But when they would talk to their family and friends about reading a book on masculinity, invariably the first question was, whose side is she on? Mm-hmm. With that tone, whose side is she on? And men tended to assume I was some kind of male-bashing feminist. Mm-hmm. More progressive people tended to assume I was some angry, defensive reactionary. Mm-hmm. And so I had to rewrite. You'll appreciate this, Greg. Mm-hmm. I had to rewrite chapter 1 multiple times to sort of get over that initial hostility coming from both sides. And so I put this study right at the beginning, the good man versus the real man that you just described. So this is a study by a sociologist. He's not a Christian, but he's very well known in his field, and so he gets invited to speak all around the world. Mm-hmm. And so he came up with this clever experiment where he would ask young men 2 questions. First, he would ask them, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral, for example, and in the eulogy somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And the sociologist said all around the globe, young men have no problem answering that. They immediately start saying things like honor, duty, sacrifice, integrity, do the right thing, be a provider, be a protector, be responsible, be generous. And he'd say, well, where'd you learn that? Mm-hmm. And the young men would say, it's just in the air we breathe. Yeah. Or if they were in a Christian country or a Western country, they would say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage.
Which is true.
But then he would, that's cool, right? And then he would ask us a follow-up question. He'd say, well, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young man would say, oh, no, that's completely different. Mm-hmm. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, suck it up, play through pain, win at all costs, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. Mm-hmm. And so what this sociologist concludes is that men everywhere do know what it means to be a good man. It's an innate, inherent knowledge. As we would say, men are made in God's image, and they do know what it means to be a good man. Romans 2, right? We all have a conscience. But they feel social pressure to live up to, quote unquote, the real man, which are traits that can be more toxic, especially if they get decoupled from a moral ideal of a good man. They can become sexually exploitive, entitlement, coercion, and control. Mm-hmm. So I put it in the front of the book to help people realize we're not for or against masculinity wholesale. We all want to support the good man, and it's perfectly fine to critique the real man, the cultural message of the real man. It also gives us a more positive way to deal with these issues because most men don't respond well to being called toxic.
Yeah.
strangely enough. So what
Surprise, surprise.
it does mean though that he gives us the tools to tap into and affirm and support their innate knowledge of what it means to be a good man. And if we can do that, we have a much more positive approach to these issues.
You mentioned innate knowledge. I think that's exemplified by, in a certain sense, the automatic response of the men at the borderline bar to do what they needed to do to protect those who were more vulnerable. I mean, you're going to have some guys that are going to run through the window. Thanks for breaking the window. I'm out of here. I'm first one out. But then you're going to have a lot of people who are men who, in innate knowledge, this understanding that they were made a different way than women, and they have a different role in virtue of that. It's the way God structured the world for human flourishing, is the way I put it. And each has different roles and place things they do best, and not that women obviously can't be courageous. I mean, one of my favorite movie characters is Ripley in the Alien series. And there is a strong, powerful woman, but it in not the least bit in the way she's characterized by Ridley Scott there as in opposition to true manliness, but a woman who rises to the occasion with bravery, and women do this all the time. But there just seems to be this additional element of the man being the hunter-gatherer, protector, provider, and mom being the nurturer type, and so. And these, what I see throughout the book is this kind of contrast between the good, virtuous, genuinely virtuous man and the so-called real man. There was a time, though, in history where, and this is, you can talk about this a little bit, when there was not a big difference between that. Pre-industrial time, the good man and the virtuous and the real man were the same thing. I think I even tell my girls sometimes to man up. But what I mean by that, I have girls that don't have boys, but what I mean by that is, look, you have to step up to the challenge and do what's right. You just have to do what you need to do because it's the right thing to do. But I understand that this is characterized in very different terms nowadays. So talk a little bit about the pre-industrial society and what men were like then.
Yes, and actually, before I go there, I'll give you one more study, just because it's so cool, another global study, because it helps us understand these. It's not just Christian insight. This really is inherent. This was by an anthropologist. He did the first ever cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. And he found that no matter how cultures define masculinity, some cultures are more warlike and others are more peaceful, but they all share the idea that a man is called to do what he called the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate. That is, be a father, build into the next generation. And again, I was just stunned when I read that, because it shows that this is an innate knowledge, an inherent knowledge that men have, that their unique masculine strengths, and men are bigger, stronger, and faster than women, but those unique strengths are given them not just to get whatever they want, but to provide, protect, and build the next generation. And you're right, it was easier to see during the pre-industrial age, because men worked alongside their wives and children in the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men was much more geared toward caretaking. You're responsible for raising your children day by day. Especially your sons. You were raising them with the skills they needed to become successful adults. You're working with your wife. You can't snap at her. So the caretaking role was very much emphasized. And in fact, this was a real shocker. Most books on parenting, like sermons, pamphlets, advice manuals, were written to fathers. Not to mothers, as most of them are today, but were written to fathers, because fathers were expected, number one, to have the primary responsibility, especially for intellectual and spiritual development of their children. And number two, they were expected to be just as involved with their kids as mothers were. There was no sense that fathers were somehow the secondary parent like today. So that was really a real surprise for me to find out. They actually use the word house father. Today we talk about housewives.
Yeah.
Back then it was fairly common to talk about house fathers.
And it wasn't like a Mr. Mom kind of feel
Right.
about it. This was a standard responsibility that the men had, and they stepped up to it.
And of course,
No
they
embarrassment.
were making their way in a wilderness, so they still had the very more traditional masculine qualities like courage and resilience and hard work. Um, but where did we lose all this? The Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into offices and factories. And for the first time in American history, they were not working alongside people that they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's when you see the language start to change. In the literature of the day, people started to protest that men were losing that caretaking ethos of the colonial era, that they were becoming self-interested, egocentric, aggressive, assertive, get ahead at all costs, look out for number one,
Right.
greedy and acquisitive, to use some of their language. And so this is the first time that you start to see negative characterization of the male character. So people who think that the concept that masculinity is toxic started with, the 1960s, maybe, second wave feminism, need to realize, no, it actually went much, much further back. People were very concerned about the male character already in the early 19th century.
When you talk about the role the fathers played in families prior to the industrial period, the industrial launch, say pre-Victorian, we'll just call it, and you have these beautiful images in your book, things that were produced, pictures of families working together and praying together and doing that, and there's Dad at the head of the whole thing. Well, I had two reactions. First of all, I read these awful stories like the abuse you faced in your childhood and others as well, and there are other characterizations of that side of humanity. I thought, well, I'm not such a bad dad, because I'm not doing anything like that. And then I read all the ways that fathers were so deeply integrated in the development of their family, the values and the spiritual things. And I thought, man, I'm really a lousy dad kind of thing. Now, later in the book, there were some really good things that were instructive to me, and we'll get to those as well in that regard. But I do want, before we get too much into the development of this understanding of male toxicity, et cetera, and how it kind of seeped into culture, and there was this conflict between the sexes that took on very, very different characteristics as time went on. I want you to mention something about the statistics comparing the twofold set of statistics comparing Christian men, Christian fathers, Christian husbands, to non-Christian fathers, husbands, etc. Because this was a stunner for me, and it really explained a lot. So go ahead. You know what I'm talking about. I see your big smile there. Yeah, it was probably a big revelation to you as well when you discovered this in your research.
Oh, absolutely, because we've all heard the media narrative that Christian men, evangelical men, are exhibit A of toxic masculinity, right? That if you believe in any form of male headship in the home, that will turn you into an overbearing, tyrannical patriarch, oppressive to women. And so,
barefoot and pregnant wives kind of thing. Yeah, right? Yeah, the stereotype, right.
I'll give you just one quote. It was easy to find quotes with a quick Google search, so I'll give you just one. So this was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she says, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So the trouble is that social scientists, psychologists, sociologists were looking at these accusations and saying, where's your evidence? You're making these charges, where's your data? And so they went and did the studies. And in my book, I cite some dozen or so studies where what they found is the exact opposite of what the media narrative is. They found out, to their own surprise, that evangelical Christian men who actually live out their faith, who are committed, who attend church regularly, test out as the most loving husbands and fathers. And
based on reports from their wives and children, basically.
Well, the pushback I get, by the way, often is they assume these were studies done by Christians, and they say, well, of course the wife's going to say she's happy. Her husband's sitting right there next to her.
Yeah.
No, that's not what these were. These were large secular databases that are drawn on by policymakers, journalists, and others. So these were not done by most of them. I have a variety of studies, but most of them were not done by Christians. And so, yes, so they're asking the wives separately. And it's the wives who are reporting the highest level of happiness with their husband's expression of love and affection. Evangelical husbands spend the most time with their kids in terms of both shared activities like sports and church youth group, and in terms of discipline like enforcing screen time or bedtime. And evangelical couples have the lowest rate of divorce of any major group in America. And then the real surprise, they have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any major group in America. Sometimes a single quote can kind of crystallize it. So let me give you a quote on that. Okay. So this is my go-to sociologist. He did the largest study. His name is Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature, he writes in places like the New York Times. So this is a New York Times article in which he said, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives." And of course, they look especially at the wives to see whether their husbands are these oppressive patriarchs. But the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. And then, actually, my favorite part of the quote is this. He then turns to his colleagues, who are mostly secular, at the University of Virginia, and he says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. So even Christians don't know this. I had to go digging into the academic literature to find this. It's not made its way into the popular realm yet. And so it really was the decisive point where I decided I have to write this book, because I wanted to get this information out into the churches where men can be encouraged. Because even in Christian churches, men often feel beaten down. When I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity at Houston Christian University, a male student shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." Okay, so even in Christian circles, men are feeling that sense of, masculinity is being derided as toxic. Well, I'll give you a quick anecdote. This was my one of my graduate students is head of women's ministry in a large Baptist church, and she said to me, "On Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell mothers they're wonderful. Yeah. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better."
Yeah, that's right. So, but now there's a certain sense, though, and your own home life is an example of that, where this characterization of Christian families is not quite accurate. And you were very careful to qualify this. These are evangelical Christian people who, in a word, are living out their Christian convictions in a real way in their lives, and therefore they represent the best of the best when it comes to marriages. But there is a whole nother strain of, let's just put scare quotes here around the word Christian, fathers and families that do not fare as well as what you described. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the first pushback I often get is, well, haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture? And in fact, in my research, I found that was one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders. And so the researchers went back to the data, and they did that important distinction that you just mentioned. They pulled out the men who are attend church regularly and really are committed Christians over against nominal Christians. By the way, my students don't even know what nominal means, so I have to explain.
Oh, gosh.
NOM is Latin for name, so it means in name only. And these are men who might check the Baptist box, for example, on a survey like this, but who don't actually attend church, rarely if at all. And they test out shockingly different. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness, with their husband's treatment of them. They spend the least amount of time with their children. They have the highest rate of divorce, even higher than the secular world. And the real shocker is they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, even higher than the secular world, even higher than secular men. And so this is why the statistics get so skewed, because if you just do a study on evangelicals, you're going to get men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. And so the statistics are going to be misleading. And this is one reason we haven't quite caught, that our committed Christian men are doing well, and it's time for us to support them and encourage them. We haven't found that because we didn't see through the statistics. So this is a very important study. And Brad Wilcox, who I mentioned before, has done the largest study, and so that's the one I recommend if anyone wants to follow up on it. But it is very academic. So I wanted to popularize that and get it out into the Christian world where men can be encouraged.
I am so glad you did that for that very reason, to give a real accurate depiction. I mean, if you're the real McCoy, this makes all the difference in the world for the good. If you're a phony, this makes all the difference in the world for the bad. And the way I think you describe it, maybe you want to say something about this, that the phonies don't have the spiritual substance and the spiritual convictions, but they do read, man is supposed to be the head of the household. And so then they find justification for being a tyrant from their shallow Christian conviction, and being a tyrant in their non-Christian behavior. Cash that out for us a little bit.
Yeah, so I do get asked by people sometimes, well, why would they be worse than secular men, right? I mean, why aren't they just the same? And apparently the reason is that they feel they have religious justification for their toxic behavior. In other words, the secular guy who's mistreating his wife and kids doesn't feel like God is blessing him, right? Is that he has religious permission for acting that way. But the Christian, the nominal Christian, is taking words like headship and submission out of the Bible, and then feels that he has religious justification for what he's doing. But what he's doing is not taking the biblical meaning of those terms. He's cherry picking. Instead, he's infusing those words with meaning from the secular script for masculinity. Because the second thing that we need to respond to, another objection is, oh, well, it's the theology itself that causes these men to be abusive. And the answer is clearly not, because the men who believe it and live it are doing very well.
That's right.
So clearly it's not the theology that's causing it. In my book, I say it's because they are infusing these words with secular meaning. So actually, that's why we need to understand the secular script, by the way, because so many Christian men, or men who claim the evangelical label, are in fact living out a secular definition of masculinity.
There are two movies come to mind, one you mentioned in your book and one that I just happen to cherish from my boyhood, that give a picture of the kind of thing we're talking about. The one I'm thinking about is Old Yeller. The Disney film with Tommy Kirk and Kevin Corcoran and this frontier family. Dad has to go away to do something for a few months, and so Tommy Kirk is like 13 years old. His dad gives him the gun, and he said, "Okay, this is your job. You plow the field. You take care of the women, mom and the kid, and Moochie." That was the nickname for this Kevin Corcoran, and it's your job. And what's evident there now? This is a '50s movie, so it's more in the modern, but it's picking up, I think, that mindset, that colonial mindset. They were still in touch with that when the writers made this movie. This kid wanted to shoulder the responsibilities that a man shoulders. He wanted to do the man's job, and he did. In fact, he got injured at one point in the movie by wild pigs as he's trying to rescue his brother who was doing something stupid. So that's one. That's a picture of this. What you're talking about, this pre-colonial real man and good man are the same. They understood it this way, and young men wanted to be that way. They wanted to be considered good real men, so to speak. And then you mentioned The Magnificent Seven, which is one of my favorite movies. I saw it when it first came out, 64 or whatever it was, and all the great, very male, very masculine men that are in there that are gunmen, and they have to rescue these villagers. And what you mentioned in your book is how they really play against type, because even though they are cast as these characters, and they are these characters, they have an evening of reflection about how empty the life is, and how it's not it's what they have, what they're stuck with, the road they chose, but it's not glamorous. And then that wonderful conversation between the Charles Bronson character and the three boys, or four Mexican boys who admire him because he's a gunman, and then they say they're your dad. I get choked up just thinking of this scene. You characterize it in the book, and many of you saw this movie, you know. And they said our dads are cowards. And he grabs a kid and he spanks him on the butt, and he said, "Don't you ever say that." And he starts lecturing. This is Charles Bronson. He's a tough guy, right? And he said, "You think I'm a brave man because I carry a gun. Your parents carry responsibility, and I don't have the courage to do that." And it's such a beautiful characterization of the kind of contrast that you're talking about here between what has been how you characterize a good man and a real man.
Yes, I've been waiting to use that story. Where's the best book to use this story?
Yeah.
Because when I saw the especially this Charles Bronson scene, when he says, you think I have courage because I carry a gun, and then he says, your parents, your fathers, not just
yes,
parents.
That's right. That's right.
Specifically, your fathers carry responsibility for your mothers, for your sisters, for you.
Right.
I have never had this kind of courage.
Right.
And for him to be able to characterize, whoever wrote that, to characterize the father's role as a type of courage. And that's a type of courage that's sadly becoming less common. You realize that here in America, 40% of children live apart from their natural fathers, and many of them never see them. It's the highest rate of single parenthood in the world. So we have a lot of men who are not coming up with that kind of courage to simply be responsible for their families. And of course, the ones who suffer the most are the boys, because boys grow up without a day-to-day model of what it means to be the good man. Everyone knows it used to be a left-right issue, but now it's on both sides. We all know that boys growing up without fathers are more likely to have trouble in school, to drop out of school, to be addicted to sex, to drugs or alcohol, to engage in sexual activity outside of marriage, and to end up behind bars. I used to work for Prison Fellowship, as you know.
Of course.
And we knew the majority of the young men behind bars were from fatherless homes, especially violent crimes.
Well, you talk in your book about the phrase you use as boy crisis and daddy deficit, and if I understand the way you ended up developing this, the daddy deficit creates a boy crisis, but the boy crisis survives into adulthood to create kind of the daddy deficit because of the kinds of things the culture ends up subtly affirming in men is what creates the toxicity.
Yes, and to put it in historical context again, you can see it already with the Industrial Revolution, because as fathers were taken out of the home to work in factories and offices, young boys were growing up without their father's supervision. And already back then in the literature, people began to complain that boys were becoming wild and unruly and rambunctious and rule-breaking. In other words, the idea of boys will be boys, that's when it started. People didn't used to say that. People used to expect boys to be just as well-behaved as girls. If anything, more well-behaved. All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, they thought that men were more virtuous than women, that they were morally superior. The rationale was this. They thought that the insight into right and wrong is a rational insight, and they thought that men were more rational, and therefore men are more virtuous.
Yeah.
The word virtue actually comes from the Latin. vir means man, as in the word virile. So even the word virtue had overtones of manly strength and honor. And so nobody had ever said, oh, well, boys will be boys, until the fathers were taken out of the home. And then boys began to be unruly, wild, misbehaving, rule-breaking. And the leading psychologists of the day put it this way. Never before in American history has the American boy been so wild. And it's because he's half-orphaned. Isn't that an interesting phrase? Half-orphaned. Wow. In other words, his dad's just not there. It's like being half an orphan. And then he said, and boys are now being left up to female guidance in home, church, and school. And of course, a boy doesn't necessarily want to follow female guidance because he thinks that makes him effeminate. And so there developed what historians call boy culture. The idea that being a real boy, this is what preceded the real man, as you so aptly put it. The real boy was the boy who was a misbehaving rascal. Even the literature of the day reveals it. The best known being Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn.
Right.
And that was a shift. It was a shift because before that, literature for children was always moralistic, to give boys a positive role model of being a good boy. But now the protagonist was a misbehaving boy, a prankster, a mischievous. At any rate, as you noted, I'm putting in the historical context, as those boys grew up, what did they do? They brought boy culture with them. And so the 19th century saw a huge increase: drinking, gambling, crime, prostitution, the number of brothels mushroomed. Sometimes a single fact can help crystallize it. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today.
That was an amazing statistic when I read that in the book. Yeah, because people drink quite a bit today. But, when I was a kid, and there's so many, we're running out of time here. It's amazing. I've offed all the commercials so we can just talk continuously. The book we're talking about, of course, is The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. In other words, there is toxicity, and there's a battle about that in our culture, and it's got all kinds of details that Nancy is very, very careful to deal with and help you understand in the book, and RX towards the end. There is a reconciliation here of of these 2 different ways of being a man, and that is understanding Christianity properly and applying it in a rich way to our lives day to day. And statistics have shown, as you pointed out, Nancy, that this is what produces the best kind of home, family, children, marriage, etc., by all assessments. By the way, one of my favorite shows when I was a kid. See, I was born in 1950, and I think we share a lot of the same lifetime, culturally speaking, and I loved watching Father Knows Best with Robert Young and Jane Wyatt. It started in 1954, and it had 6 seasons or something like that. I loved watching that as a kid, because this was I had a very paternalistic home, but Robert Young was the best of dads, and even the Mickey Rooney movies from before our time, when his father was a judge, he was kind of a rascally boy. That was the characteristic of this Mickey Rooney character, but he could always go back to Dad to give him advice and whatever. So even with the Industrial Revolution and the jobs pulling dads out of the homes and everything, there still was this kind of believing remnant, it seemed like, that would still hold the line. And characteristically, these were people who deeply committed to Christian values. Would that be a fair statement?
Oh, yes. I try to be encouraging throughout the book by showing that all along, there were Christian men, Christian fathers who were living out a biblical understanding of fatherhood and family and so on. Because, as you know, Greg, I'm an apologist at heart. And so my main goal is to show why the secular world gets masculinity so wrong. I want to equip Christians to stand against the secular definition of masculinity, the denigration of masculinity. And so I don't make my major theme, what were Christian families doing? I put that in as sort of a, don't forget that all along there were Christians who were in fact living out a Christian understanding. And you mentioned that the book has pictures. When you're dealing with history, it helps a lot to have pictures. One of my favorite pictures is in the section on don't forget there were Christian fathers, because it shows a father surrounded by his family. His kids are around him. Like there's a kid in his lap. The wife is sewing, but next to them, and he's reading a book to the family. And of course they don't know for sure, but it's probably a Bible. At any rate, that image of the father who still, even though he's out of the home most of the day, when he comes home, he's coming home to his second job.
That's right.
And he's making a point of helping the kids with the homework, participating in the housework. And after the homework's done, they sit around and they gather on the piano and sing, or they gather around and read a favorite book together. And it was amazing how much, even the secular historians, one of my books is on the history of fatherhood. And even the secular historian mentions how much the Christian father continued to be a model of fatherhood, even for the men who were no longer active Christians. This was fascinating. He said the Protestant Christian husband was still setting the tone that men who were becoming irreligious still followed that Protestant pattern for raising their own kids. They knew that was best for their kids.
Yeah, so good.
So you're right. And of course, I do have a whole chapter on, today, is it possible to sort of flex the workplace? We're not just stuck with the Industrial Revolution. The pandemic taught a lot of people that there are ways to sort of flex the workplace. And just today, Greg, I looked at a Harvard study, and it was the title was something like this: during the pandemic, fathers got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
68% of fathers said they did not want to go back to the office full time. They wanted some kind of hybrid situation.
Because of what they gained. And that certainly is possible. It's an RX for what we're facing. I feel real badly. I was going to say I'm giving the short shrift to the last part of your book, which is an RX a lot for Christian families who are struggling with toxic masculinity. And a lot of times the wives get blamed and the pastors go along with the husbands, not the wives who are the victims. And you talk a lot about that. And so my apologies that we haven't done this for 2 hours and we've only had 1 hour here to do this, but I hope it's given a really good introduction to your unbelievable amount of research. I mean, we're both writers, but I look at this and I say, man, that's hard stuff. I just had 85,000 words in Street Smarts, and I thought I was working. This is more than that, and you have so many footnotes. All the research that went into this makes it such a superb work and so helpful for Christians in their own families, and also dealing with the kind of challenges of toxic masculinity that they hear in the culture. It's there, but the remedy is not women's liberation, but the Christian understanding of reality.
The story of reality.
There you
Have
go.
I heard this somewhere before?
Nancy, thanks so much for spending time with us, and I hope we get a chance to face-to-face it somewhere along the line in the future. Thanks for your help on this book.
Thanks so much. You have such penetrating questions that it's a joy to talk with you.
Thanks. Nancy Pearcey, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Greg Kokel here for Stand to Reason. Give them heaven, friends. Bye-bye now.